Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Food Lovers Elective, a craft conversation series. Thank you so much for joining us today. So at Craft, we seek to foster a transformative regional food system in Western Pennsylvania that recognizes the central role of food systems in our society and values of the people who live and work within them. We envision a food system that is equitable, fostering fairness and transparency across the value chain. A system that is sustainable, actualizing economic, social, and cultural well-being as part of the food system. And a food system that is inclusive, valuing dignity, sovereignty, and the inherent power of all people. So today's episode is Big Kid Lunchbox topics: nutrition, sustainability, and values in food procurement. Our student moderator is Lexy Baird, a graduate student with Chatham's Food Studies program. She is going to be talking with Malik Hamilton, a Chatham alum and the current production and purchasing coordinator for the Food Services Department at Pittsburgh Public Schools. This episode will take about an hour, with the last 10 to 15 minutes reserved for Q&A. Please feel free to chat with us throughout the episode. You'll be able to chat with us or send us your questions through the Q&A option on the bottom of your screen. So we hope that you guys enjoy this discussion, and I will now hand it off to Lexi.
Hey everyone. All right, nice to have you here. My name is Lexy Baird, and I'm a soon-to-be second year here at Chatham University in the Masters of Food Studies program. And I started this program really wanting to figure out what a sustainable food system can mean. And I'm still in the process of figuring that out. It's a huge question. Some of those components to defining that are like, how does food get to people? Does it get to people? Where does free school lunch come from for kids, and how does that look globally? As well as like social justice in different areas of the food system. And so that is kind of what's influencing this conversation. And a branch of that is what we're going to talk about today with Malik. And as Ani said, Malik works at the Pittsburgh Public Schools as the procurement supervisor. He's also a Chatham alum, which is really cool. He's a food service industry expert, and he has skills in food service management, production, and procurement. He's also on the Pittsburgh Regional Food Service Directors Bid Committee. And his goals are to provide high quality food for Pittsburgh Public Schools, which is really, really cool. And so given that you're a change maker right now in the food system, Malika, I'm really excited to talk to you about your work and the larger role that you and I can play in the food system. So welcome and thanks for joining me in this conversation. So we're going to start off now. What are your pronouns, and is there a fun fact about yourself?
My pronouns are he, him, his. And the fun fact, so I talked to my wife about what I should say if this came up. And she said that I should say that I applied for and got accepted to grad school without talking to her first. And that was kind of interesting at the end.
Hey, you did it.
It all worked out. We moved.
Yeah. That's good.
I don't recommend it for anyone else.
Yeah, I mean, communication's important. But what curiosities did you have about the food system after your time here at Chatham? And did those kind of influence you and your job at Pittsburgh Public Schools?
I don't know particularly what curiosities I had, other than I was even more amazed at all of the complexities of the food system. Having worked in food service for a bunch of years before that, I was aware of some things, but not quite to the extent that I was after I graduated from Chatham.
Yeah.
And actually kind of worked opposite. So I actually got this job while I was working on my thesis. And so as far as influencing my current curiosities, it was my job that has gotten me to thinking about things that I wasn't thinking about prior to graduating.
Yeah, I think that's what's really fascinating about food, is that it's so much more complex than you could ever imagine. So yeah, we're gonna roll into some of these questions about your role at Pittsburgh Public Schools. So from what I understand, the USDA, the US Department of Agriculture, it places requirements on food that can be fed to students and nutrition. But I am guessing that's not the most easy thing to coordinate. So I guess, how does the USDA put guidelines on the choices that you make in your position?
Yeah, you bet. So there's a couple distinctions there. So first of all of the USDA regulations are tied to districts that are participating in the National School Lunch Program, the National School Breakfast Program, those federal feeding programs. There are a lot of districts in the country that do not participate, and so they have more flexibilities in what they serve on a daily basis. Pretty much they can serve whatever their district has determined as being acceptable. Through the USDA, so it's the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act that all of our regulations come through, and so there are regulations on from a nutritional standpoint. There's sodium and calories. We have to serve different types of vegetables throughout the week. So really, the entire plate is regulated in some way by USDA regulations. And it can be very difficult to meet those because, so the example that we often give is that, you have to have a red orange and a leafy green, and you have and a legume and all these different vegetable parts but occasionally you end up where you find yourself having to menu like peanut butter and jelly with baked beans or something that, you know, things just don't fit sometimes when you're trying to put together a menu.
Yeah. So I guess then how do you balance like nutrition and good tasting food or things that kids will eat with those requirements?
It can be tough. We have a lot of conversations about how we don't end up putting, you know, baked beans with peanut butter and jelly. Occasionally, partly also so our structure of our department. Occasionally, you get stuck where you're juggling all these balls, and you have to account for labor and production time, and so you end up where you're like, well, that's not the best possible combination of food, but we also have to hit these regulations. So as often as possible, we try not to serve anything that you wouldn't normally serve at your house together. And most of the time we're successful.
Is there an example of like a really popular plate?
I think our most popular item year in and year out is we do a walking taco. So we taco meat and chips and cheese and all of that good stuff. That's one of those that they had at the district long before I got there, and I imagine that we will never actually remove it from the menu.
Yeah, that's fun. I love those. And so to what extent are kids involved in the menu making process or like purchasing process?
So we try and engage the students as much as possible, and we continue to try and increase that. Our goal is to at some point have a day on the menu at least every other week where we are testing products throughout grade categories. So there's some items that we only serve at maybe the middle school, high school level, and things that we only serve at the elementary level, just because there's some palate things that the littler kids aren't going to take to as much as the older kids. So that is our goal, is for it to be just a regular part of our menu cycle. Right now, as we find new things that we want to test out, we will put all that together. We'll choose 2 or 3, 4 schools, and we will, over a course of a week or so, go out and have somebody there with samples of that item, let the students vote on it, and then, you know, depending on what those overall acceptability votes are, we'll determine if we put that on the menu or if we need to go back to the drawing board on it. We also work, the superintendent has a student advisory council, so we work with them a couple of times a year and kind of get some feedback from them, and we use them as ambassadors in the cafeterias when we are doing testing and just kind of getting feedback from the students, because sometimes it's easier to voice your concerns or ask questions of one of your peers than, you know, an adult who you might think isn't really listening. And then we also do a food show every January, at the end of every January. And we invite a lot of students, you know, the Student Advisory Council, there are a couple other student groups that we invite to come in and walk around that food show. It's held in our central production facility. So they meet with brokers and vendors from different manufacturers that we may be partnering with or that would like to partner with us. We also bring in a chef from our distributor who will make something, you know, a fresh idea that we're thinking about or would like the students' feedback on. So they get all of that experience as well, and we take their feedback, and that's part of our decision-making process for the following school year.
That's so fun. I had no idea that happened. Wow. It's really important to have their input, obviously, because they're the ones eating the food. Yeah. And then do you think that, and I'm asking this because my thesis plans have shifted a little bit. So like, do you think the school has a role in shaping the way that kids think about food in society?
I think, yes, whether it's planned or not, we do. I think it's better if we can plan it and be a part of the educational model right? Build some more food knowledge and nutrition knowledge into the curriculum. We do have a community partner that we have several actually that go into the classroom, some of the classrooms, and they're teaching nutrition, like we work with Grow Pittsburgh, and they manage a bunch of all of the school gardens that we have. We're right around 25 schools with gardens. And so part of that is that they work with students that are involved with that to teach them about that process, that growing process, and why fresh produce and things like that. And then we have Adagio Health that actually goes into some of the classrooms as well and teaches nutrition. So we'd love to be more involved in that. If it requires us to be able to find some teachers that are willing to build that into the curriculum and kind of supporting that as well.
Yeah, it definitely takes a lot, because I feel like food in general isn't something that is deep dived in everyday teaching. So, and now I'm gonna ask about your thesis, which I read a little bit of it, and it discusses value-based supply chains, which is something I'm super interested in at Allegheny County. And you focused on nutrition and good food and procurement, and now you're at Pittsburgh Public Schools, and you're also a part of the Pittsburgh Food Policy Council, which is really fascinating. So I guess, could you talk a little bit about the big issues in your thesis, and then kind of how Pittsburgh Food Policy Council is influencing your work now?
Yeah, you bet. So first, it amazes me that people actually read my thesis. Every so often I'm in a meeting and somebody will reference my thesis, and it just boggles my mind. But yeah, in there, so I had done an internship at the health department, we were tracking policies, food-centered policies, and through some conversations that I had with my mentor at the time, when I was doing that internship, we kind of hit on this idea of value-based procurement for food at the county level. And so I decided I wanted to do my thesis on that, started digging into it. It talked a lot about, some of the bigger things I talked about in there was how that could all be tied into an overall higher wellness policy, not only for county employees, but the community at large. So the county does a lot of food-based procurement through, they have the cane centers, they have the jail, there are different, the city county building does some, there's concession stands at swimming pools and around the whole county. So they're spending a lot of money on food. And so it was a conversation about how do we better use that money to change the food system. And it was all really interesting. At the same time that we're having that conversation, there were some folks actually on the county executive board who were asking that same question. And so those are things that we looked at. We talked about, one of the things that I suggested in there was to start small, right? So pick one location, if it's the jail, say, maybe you're buying 40,000 pounds a year of potatoes. So then get with a farmer or even two and say, we need, up to 40,000 pounds. We're going to guarantee the sale. And then that's the process to start really small and then see how that works. Iron out all the bugs and then go forward from there.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Like being able to pair who's local and having them contribute to this larger food system chain. And then, rounding back to the Pittsburgh Food Policy Council stuff, how's that been, and what kinds of things have you learned or contributed in that work?
Yeah, so the Food Policy Council is one of our bigger partners. So we actually partnered with them in Grow Pittsburgh 3 years ago, so 2017 to 2019, I believe, on a farm to school grant. So we got a $100,000 farm to school grant through the USDA. We were able to, we started a Harvest of the Month program where we highlight a different vegetable every month on the menu. So be it through salads that we offer or a side vegetable, something like that. So that's a good piece, and there's an educational piece that goes with that as well. They are a big part of our current Good Food Purchasing Policy Coalition. They're actually kind of the base for that. So they pulled a lot of different folks from different areas of the food chain and brought them to the table so that we could have this discussion about good food purchasing at Pittsburgh Public Schools and what that can look like, how we get the policy in place, and then that same coalition will continue to come together after the policy is in place to help put together goals and look at where we started and where we're going and how we can continue to get better at value-based purchasing at the school district.
Yeah. I guess just to zoom out for people who might not know, can you kind of explain what good food purchasing policy entails and how
Certainly,
did you?
yeah.
Go ahead.
So I was working on my thesis that I found the good food purchasing policy that actually started in LA. So the LA Unified School District in LA County wanted to make some changes to the way that they were purchasing and wanted them to be kind of long-standing. And so they put together this program that's actually based off of the LEADS program for architecture. So there are various standards, some of which, nutrition, local economies, environmental sustainability, fair labor, things of that sort. They've got 5 of those, and then you are able to, once you become a part of this program, they help you do a baseline assessment to look at where you're at on all of those categories, and you can certify at different levels. And then being part of that, there are kind of benchmarks that you're trying to reach every year over a series of years to try and better the way that you are purchasing food for be it your school district or their cities, counties, whatever it is, whatever institutional based purchasing organization has signed up. And so they've been a huge part of that for us. And we, right now we're working on the draft language for that, because if you say, we're going to purchase humane food, well, what does that mean? In the larger scope, what does it mean here in Pittsburgh and Southwest Pennsylvania, in that region, and kind of talking through all of that.
Yeah. Do you think that using the influence of this good food purchasing program model, do you feel like you have to compromise on things, or like at what points do you have to push to make those kinds of changes in how you buy food?
So I imagine at some point, all policy has some compromise in it, right? So we will get to a point, I think, where we're going to have to make some compromises and make some realistic goals based on the capacity of the region. But even so, even though the policy isn't in place yet, we have been working to put things in place to fit the policy, so that we're not starting from scratch. So one of the big things that has happened recently, a couple big things that happened recently, we worked with with Turner's Dairy, who is our milk provider. One of the concerns, with both the USDA regulations and with the nutrition piece of our good food purchasing policy, are sodium levels. And the fat-free chocolate milk that they had a large amount of sodium in it. And so about a year ago, we reached out to them and said, these are the sodium targets, and this is the sodium in your chocolate milk, this is the sodium in competitors' chocolate milk. Can we find a balance? And they, over the course of that year, were able to work on their formulation to a point where they pulled about 150 milligrams of sodium out of their fat-free chocolate milk. It's now it's in balance with everything else that's out there and what we need it to be. And that was a great thing. So it's great for not only us, but now other school districts around the area that are looking for lower sodium, fat-free chocolate milk have that option.
Mhm.
We also work with them. We also buy our juice from them as well. And so their grape juice, we already know that they purchase that majority of that, the grapes for that juice in like the Erie area, the northern Pennsylvania area. And so we're working with them now to see if we can't also either change the formulation to make sure that it's at least 51% Pennsylvania grapes, or find out that it is actually 51% and be able to label that as local.
Yeah.
So we're already kind of being able to make some changes that way, which is super cool and a lot of fun to see happen.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's one of the biggest impacts that might happen from even just using your position. It's like, it's really important to be able to change things so that like the sodium levels in the milk, I had no idea, like you have to have these restrictions from the USDA, but then you have to source it from the right place, and it's a lot to balance. It's just fascinating to learn about. And I guess, what are your hopes for the future in making more decisions like this?
My hope is that we will bring a lot of people in the region on board as far as understanding what this is and making some changes. So we are working, so our current produce vendor is Paragon Foods, which you are familiar with, I know.
Yeah.
But we also have done work in the past and continue to do work with another larger distributor, Monteverde, here in the region.
Mm-hmm.
And so we always have these conversations with both entities about where can we go, and how do we, those that aren't maybe necessarily at the same level as like a Paragon, how do we help you to kind of move forward so that you're lining up with the good food purchasing policy? Because even if they never win our bid, they'll become a better organization for those that they do service.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's how we because Pittsburgh Public Schools is the second largest in the state, and it's like Philly on the coast and us in the west. We kind of feel a bit of a stewardship in this side of the state to open some doors for the smaller districts that maybe couldn't make those changes on their own.
Mm-hmm.
And it's cool because, sometimes with policy you think, oh, this is going to be a fight. You kind of fluff up your feathers so that you can go in and you're going to tell everybody, this is why it's important and this is why you got to do it. And I have found sometimes you just have to ask. And they're like, oh yeah, well, that sounds great. Let's do it.
Yeah, it's good to know. I think as sustainability becomes more present, then it's not that new of an idea to talk about with people, which is really cool. And so this idea of sustainable consumption is one I want to bring into the conversation. When we're talking about the food system and how we've been talking about food procurement and like getting food for schools, I think everyone has a place in the food system, and we can make choices as consumers or in your position wherever you're at, whether it be Pittsburgh Public Schools or somewhere else. And organizations and institutions can do more to support those sustainable practices in the food chain. And to me, this sustainable consumption means making decisions and getting food, but like influencing like the good food purchasing policy practices of ethical environmental regulations and society and social justice. And so I guess how would you define sustainable consumption for like your position as a procurement person?
The short answer is doing the right thing just because it's the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something that we talk about in the department a lot is, well, if we do this, what are these people going to say? What are those people going to say? This, that, and the other. And at some point it's like, well, it's the right thing to do for either our students or for our operation or our district. So we should just do it because it's the right thing to do. And we don't necessarily have to put out a press release that we did it. You know, not everything has to be is newsworthy. And so that's part of that. So when I think about sustainable consumption, that's the first thing that I think about is it right to do and just do it?
Yeah.
The other part is, so sustainability for us as a department includes, can we sustain it financially for long term? Can we sustain it? Is the capacity there for us to continue to get this certain product that we find is sustainable? Are the students going to enjoy it long enough to, so we deal with a lot of menu fatigue.
Mm-hmm.
So if I bring in, 50 cases of item X that's, local and sustainable and no GMO, hits all of the check boxes, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the students get bored with it 10 cases in, a couple of months in, well then, we spent this money, it's now cost us extra to buy that item that, looked great and sounded nice, but it's not sustainable because the students aren't going to eat it.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of different pieces. I think when we talk about sustainability, we always think about like the environment and husbandry and things like that. But sometimes it goes into, is anybody going to eat it? Because if it's just going to end up in the landfill, then you've really kind of shot yourself in the foot.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's one thing that is really important when we talk about sustainability and defining sustainability is like, you can't forget the people aspect of it. And I think thinking about menu fatigue is, I've never thought about that, but then at the same time, like when I try to meal plan, it happens. It's just human. And so I guess in an ideal world, with no restraints or as much money as you could have, how would you at Pittsburgh Public Schools try to tackle everything and make good food purchasing happen?
I mean, if we had, endless money and resources, we'd do the same things that we're trying to do now, only we do them much faster and maybe on a grander scale. So right now, the conversation that we're having, so once upon a time, when the district was much larger, our central production facility actually created a majority of the meals inside of that building. When economies started to crash, and there've been a couple of large crashes over the years, there was a point where the decision was made, or the conversation was had, whether it was financially better to kind of move over to more processed items, which is where the industry and the market was going at the time, or to continue to try and maintain this large facility into the equipment and replacing things as they were breaking down. We're ironically right now, everything is trying to circle back to the way it was. And of course, things cost a lot more to get as far as machinery and that stuff. And so if we had infinite funds, that's where we would probably do that as some infrastructure that would make it easier to do more scratch cooking and more fresh produce. We'd love to be able to have a facility where we could buy fresh produce in the summertime and process it into, sauces and side vegetables or whatever through the summer and have that available through the winter. Because that's the tough part about school food, right? Is that when everything is fresh and lovely and delicious on the farm, all of our students are at home. And we're not serving at the same level as we would be in November, December, January. So
that's a really challenging question. Is including seasonality is very difficult, and utilizing foods that have been preserved or something. Like that's just a whole extra layer of bringing in to the planning aspect of it. And I guess just to expand, what does your day-to-day look like? And I'm asking that just so maybe people can see further into how all of these choices and these big ideas are made at a real-time person's position.
Yeah, you bet. So I don't actually have a typical day.
Hmm.
There's always something new, I feel like. We joke that we can find a new way, a new problem to solve every day if we really put our minds to it.
Hmm.
But there's always going to be, we have 54 buildings. So at any given time, one of those buildings can have a concern or a problem. A freezer or a cooler can go down. And then, what do you do with that product? How long is it going to take to repair that freezer or that walk-in cooler? Do I have to send a driver to a building and pull all of that food out of that building and bring it to our warehouse and then take it back once it's fixed? Then how do you feed the students at that building?
Yeah.
Right. So if I have to take all of their food out of their building, then how do we then feed them until all that food can be put back? So there's a lot of that. I have a big, I call it my crumb board, where I have a list of various categories of things, and then everything that I need to be working on is put up on that board, and we move it back and forth based on urgency. Constantly working, we've got a dietitian who works on our menus, which you would think, if you're writing right now, she's writing the August menu. You think, oh, that's a couple of days. You write the menu, you put it, and it's usually by the time she gets the next month's menu done, she has to almost immediately start the menu after that. Just because of the time that it takes. We then have to sit down with production and say, okay, how does this going to work out? Is the production schedule going to fit this? What do we need to move around? I also, again, because we're so big, so much bigger than most of the school districts and other institutions on this side of the state, our supplier doesn't always have enough of a product on hand. So during the school year, let's say, so on September 1, I will actually give them our forecast and place some of our orders for October. So our food service, our dietitian always has to be that far ahead. There's also the timeline of K-12 food service in general is such that, so we get federal funds from USDA every year. They're called commodity dollars. But we have to tell USDA that we want them to send chicken to Rich Chicks in this quantity, and we're going to use cheese from Land O'Lake in this quantity. We have to do all of that in March, late March, early April of the previous school year. So this coming March and April, we will tell the USDA what food we're planning on using for the 22-23 school year. Right, so by February, the dietitian has to have some sort of working cycle menu in place so that we can actually do the forecast for that. And then of course that it changes, from February to August, there are going to be changes. But those changes have to happen within the manufacturers that we have already chosen. So we can very easily get pigeonholed that way. And so that's the one thing I think that people don't understand about K-12 food service is that we operate months and months and months in advance. When we've had to train manufacturers who want us to use their product in the summers, if you haven't come to me in like February or March, we've already made, not only we already built the summer menu and talked to everybody involved with that, but I've already put in orders to the distributor so that we have food product available to us in time to do summer.
Yeah.
Which is not, you don't see that anywhere else in the food service industry.
That's a lot of planning. I had no idea. And a lot of pre-planning. And I mean, I can't even imagine when things like COVID happen. Like, you have no clue what's going to happen in the future. And all of that time it takes to plan and buy and store. And it's a lot of logistics.
Yeah.
Who knew?
COVID rocked our world.
Huh?
COVID rocked our world. It
I
really,
can't
really
imagine.
rocked our world.
Yeah.
We're going to feel COVID probably all the way through this entire school year and maybe a little bit into next.
Oh my goodness. That's just a tragedy. Well, thanks so much for sharing about your position and all of the things that it takes to be able to do what you do. I think it's fascinating and definitely eye-opening for sure. And I guess I just wanted to wrap up with some questions. Did you ever see yourself as someone who would do something like this?
No, not at all. This was never on my radar. There were a lot of things that I thought I was going to do before I got to Chatham, and there were other things that I thought I was going to do as I was wrapping up at Chatham, and I'm in this place that I never thought I would be.
Yeah, it's kind of how life goes, I think. Are there any suggestions or advice for students like myself who are really yearning for a way to bridge the gap between, like, what do we learn at school and then how do we actually apply this in the real world?
So the one thing I would say, based on my experience, is be open. So there are opportunities to be a part of something. So say you're interested in K-12, you don't necessarily have to work for a school district to be involved in the K-12 food service space. Just locally, like the Pittsburgh Food Policy Council has a couple of different positions that we work with, or not the Policy Council, the food bank has several positions, that we work with a lot about feeding students. There are organizations like the Dairy Council, National Dairy Council, that do a ton of work for us in the K-12 space and provide us with blenders for making smoothies, and they sponsor events, and they do so much for us in the K-12 space. So there are a lot of options, and I think that's going to be the way in any industry. As far as food is concerned, is if there's something that you really want to do, try and think outside of that core and say, oh, well, what about this? Or maybe they're getting it from there, and maybe I can be a part of it that way. Yeah. That's my thing, is kind of keep it open.
Yeah, that's really good advice, is like, try to imagine a different way that you can learn about what you're interested in, which is really fun. And then, are there any suggestions for people who might not know that they have a role in the food system? Do you have any suggestions for them?
Well, I think everybody has a role. I mean, if you eat, you're in the food system. And so I would say start at your plate, right? And think about what's on my plate and what am I eating? Where did it come from? And who grew it, who processed it, like how does it end up on your plate? And kind of work backwards from there and start having conversations with people. Not only, if you have access to a local farmer, talk to them about what they do. And, they plan almost as far in advance, maybe further in advance than I do in food service. So you can have kind of interesting conversations, and you'll learn a few things, and you can share that, and it might change the way you, the decisions that you make as far as the food that you purchase and how you purchase it and things of that nature.
Yeah, definitely. That's a really good piece of advice, is like, what are you even eating right now? And look and see where you've gotten those and what choices you can make. So I'm gonna go through some of the questions in the chat with you.
Okay.
And I think I'm gonna start with, let's see, Laura Valentine was curious to hear about the COVID response at Pittsburgh Public Schools. And so we're gonna start there since that was one of the most recent things we talked about.
So COVID, the COVID response, I guess, I'll just do it from food service because I wasn't involved with everything at the wider district. We were actually in a really good place. We didn't actually start to feel real problems with COVID until April or May from a supply standpoint, because remember, I'm ordering so far in advance. So, you know, when we shut down in March, I had April's food. The rest of March and April's food was already available to us. So we were, and we had, a year or two ago, we were looking at, there was a possibility of a strike, a teacher strike. And so we had sat down as a managerial team and talked about, okay, if there's a strike, how are we going to feed kids? And then we made that a procedure, right? We wrote all of that down. So when we got the call March 13th and said, you know, if we shut down, if we go into quarantine, how will we feed kids? We were able to say, oh, we've already got that plan. So we were able to immediately put that into place. So that was awesome to be able to do that. And then throughout COVID, we also actually played a huge role in helping some of the smaller districts get some of the things that they needed for a couple of different reasons. One, because of our model and having different schools that have different capabilities, we were already purchasing some items that were grab and go friendly. And so we were able to, some of those were proprietary to us. We were able to tell the distributor, hey, let anybody who needs this buy it. And so we were able to do that. There are some things, so in the K-12 space, there are producers that have minimum order quantities that they require of a distributor before they'll send it in. So there were several times when we were able to kind of guarantee to the distributor, said, look, we'll cover if you have to bring in a minimum quantity of X hundred of cases, but there's, you know, the region only needs, the schools in the area only need maybe half of that. Pittsburgh Public Schools will take that other half. We will make sure that it gets used. And so that made it possible for some districts to get some things that they might have struggled to get otherwise.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, I've never thought about how much influence, because PPS is so big, that it can have on other places. And then there's another COVID question I'm going to ask from Sophie Lagore. With COVID, how did you navigate any shortages? And did you have to change plans as time went on?
We were constantly adjusting. So we had more of a problem with overage, right? So we have about 23,000 students. If you send them all home, only a certain number of them are going to be able to come out, right? So a lot of students live, you know, more than a mile from the school that they go to. They might live more than a mile to the next closest neighborhood school. So they might have been going to a rec center or something that maybe we were doing through city parks or the food bank, or some other organization was handing out food. So they're not all coming to us, but we had food for 23,000 students plus when we went into quarantine. So there was a lot of moving pieces. And then of course, nobody really knew when we were going to go back, if we were going to go back. There was always a target date. Again, looking at what we had on hand and then looking at the target date and doing all of those forecasts, then you would order more food and then we wouldn't go back. So we actually ended up having some more problems with having too much food at various times. The problems as far as shortages started coming when manufacturers couldn't produce product. And then we would just have to shift to a new item on the menu. So we got through it a little better than I think some did.
Great. And then a couple more questions. Let's do it. Cynthia asked, you mentioned an educational component related to the local sourcing or good food purchasing. Is that education for the students? And then how do they feel about or contribute to those values in those systems?
So yeah, the educational piece would be for them. So we do, like Harvest of the Month, there's an educational piece. We also participate in a federal program called the Fresh Fruit and Vegetable Program, which is a grant program for elementary schools, which allow us to, we provide 2 fruits and a vegetable, fresh fruits or vegetable to the students in some form or another for them to, they can snack on it in their classroom or they can take it home. We really just try and expose them to a wider range of produce. So like we were able to give them like dragon fruit and watermelon radish and just things that they're just maybe either not going to see or not going to have the option of having, they might not have, they're not going to have it on their dining room table maybe if it's not something that they culturally they would eat.
Yeah.
So they get exposed to that as well. So there are a lot of, we're trying to work on the educational piece into the good food purchasing policy as well, and that's going to be something that our outside partners are going to have to help us with.
Yeah.
To get that in there. We're also hoping though too, as word about this gets out, that there will be more teachers who, we know that there are teachers out there who have these same values, who may not know that we're working on it from this end as well, who might be able to jump on and say, oh, I can do this from my classroom to help support that.
Yeah. That'd be really fascinating to see as like a educational collective of people. And I think too, you mentioned school gardens, and that's like a really cool place to start too, is if you start contributing that into curriculum and stuff. As far as menu planning goes, Frankie has a question here. What is your strategy for reaching picky eaters? And is there some kind of reward program that students can participate in for trying something new? It's a good question.
It is a good question. So picky eaters is hard, right? So we know, so right now we're working on we want to put a pasta dish, be it tortellini or ravioli, some sort of filled pasta. We want to use some rosé sauce. And so we've been working on different recipes. Well, one thing that we know is that at the younger level, usually if there's green or specks in something that they can't identify as something, that they're familiar with, they just simply won't touch it. So we're working on a recipe that would be palatable to the kindergarten to 5th graders. That would be speckless and greenless. But then, for the middle school to high schools, then we're trying to spice that up a little bit. So there will be more evident presence of basil and oregano or things like that in there. So that's one thing that we do with picky eaters. We also offer alternatives. So it's rarely just the one item. So during COVID, it's been more of that, where this is what we have and this is your choice. We had to do that from a regulatory standpoint and from a standpoint of keeping everybody safe. But normally we have 2 or 3 different options. So if a student doesn't necessarily like what's on the main line, there's something that we try to put popular items on that alternative menu. So then the student will be able to grab something from there and still get fed. That's our big thing, is making sure we feed kids.
Yeah, make sure they get their food. And then I guess a follow-up question Frankie had, which we kind of touched on, but I think it's good to ask. Do students have an opportunity to become more familiar with ingredients by doing cooking activities in class? Or I guess any other kind of cooking related education? So
there, to my knowledge, is not, other than we have 2 trade programs. One is in, I'm going to get the schools wrong right now. I believe Westinghouse and Carrick are the 2 high schools that have culinary programs. And I should know which ones they are. So we're actually working with them. We just got a grant with the Pennsylvania Farm to School grant, which they are developing USDA recipes for some fresh produce. So we drew asparagus, and so we are working with the culinary arts students to develop recipes that will then be tested in the schools. And we actually end up whittling that down to 2 recipes that meet the regulations of the USDA. And then those recipes will then, it's a 2-year grant. Then we kind of do a recipe swap with other districts in the area in the state that were granted or given this grant, and we'll test each other's recipes. And then all of those recipes will be submitted to USDA and be part of their larger database of recipes that will be accessible to any school district or anybody that wants to go on their website and pull those down. And so this was a great opportunity for us to get with at least some of the students that are interested in cooking and knowing more about cooking, giving them a chance to be part of this process of choosing what can be on the menu, and also kind of give them some recognition in the community on the work that they do. So that's pretty awesome. But yeah, there's, like home ec went way a long time, probably 10, 15 years ago now. So it's a sad thing.
Yeah. I loved home ec. Oh my goodness. Making cookies for class. Okay. Yeah, that's really fascinating to hear about the Farm to Table grant. And just my own curiosity, are there other schools who drew a different item?
Yeah, so they actually, you put in your grant, and then there's, I want to say 5 or 6 different ones. So I remember butternut squash was one and mushrooms was another. And then they also gave you choices on, or they assigned you a grade category. So we got high school, but it could have been middle school or elementary.
Cool. All right, so we're wrapping up here. I've got one final question for you, and then I'll hand it over to Ani.
Okay.
Can you tell me a little bit about Jell-O?
I can tell you a lot of it about Jell-O, but given time constraints. So yeah, I did a couple of different papers and presentations on Jell-O while I was at Chatham. I moved to Pittsburgh from Utah. First consumer of Jell-O in the country. And so, in fact, Jell-O was the first state snack in the country, and that was Utah made green Jell-O, their state snack. And Senator Mike Lee, when he was in office, actually had every Wednesday had Jell-O with the senator, and so you could go in and have Jell-O with Senator Mike Lee. So yeah, I have a lot of experience with Jell-O, just growing up as close to the Jell-O belt that I did, and it was good. Jell-O was good to me through my career there at Chatham.
Oh yeah, I do love one of our things that we make every year is strawberry pretzel Jell-O salad. If anyone's had that, it's delicious. All right, thanks Malik so much for talking with me. This is really fascinating stuff, and we appreciate you for coming on. I'm going to hand it over to Ani now.
Awesome.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Well, so I have to ask, what's your favorite flavor of Jell-O?
Orange is my favorite flavor, followed closely by lime.
Ooh.
Okay. So you're not afraid of green Jell-O?
No, not at all.
Okay.
Not at all.
Awesome. Perfect. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us and sharing your expertise, both of you guys. I really appreciate it. So Chatham community and friends, if you want to see what it takes to be in Lexy's seat as a student moderator for future episodes, or if you would like to be a future guest like Malik, please click the link posted in the chat to fill out the submission form. You can also email us at craft@chatham.edu for further information. If you have suggestions for future guests or topics, feel free to access that link as well, even if you're like, I don't think that's for me, but let's volunteer this person. We love those as well. A survey should pop up as soon as this webinar is ended. Please fill it out to give us feedback. And the link will also be sent in a follow-up email as well. Of course, follow us on Instagram and on Facebook at Craft Chatham. And then stay tuned for next week's episode, Pierogi, you can tell I'm not from Pittsburgh, Pierogi to Pakora, the transformation of Erie's immigrant food culture, as student moderator Peter Zimmer talks with Delana Grassinger, Director of U.S. Community for Refugees and Immigrants, about the evolving food culture in Erie, PA. This episode will air at 2 p.m. and of course is a free event, so invite your friends. Again, thank you guys so much. I hope you guys have a great rest of the day and we'll see you next week.
Bye.
Right.